Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Nick, and Hermann. I hope you're both well.
Pretty good, all things considered. We also have Mr. Hermann Pretorius here. Hermann, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. It's good to be with you, and it's good that it's Friday.
Yeah,
it is. Right, let us get into our first story of today. And this is about the terrible state of South Africa's cyber security. Now, as I've said many times on the show before, if you have ever interacted with a government website, you will know that South Africa's relationship between government and the internet is not exactly a very strong relationship. I always think back to that memorable time that I was cruising through the Gauteng provincial government website, and I was met by a great big banner at the top of the page which said, placeholder image, insert image here. Or when you try to use a government service and you get that horrible message, requires Internet Explorer 5 or higher in order to work. And you just sort of go, oh no. So it comes as no surprise that there's been quite a lot of reporting suggesting that South Africa's government systems are very vulnerable to cyber attacks. And there have been a number of incidents. The most terrible one has probably been the hacking of the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission database, which appears to have had a lot of its information compromised and potentially stolen by hackers. Now, it's difficult to say what exactly that might be used for. It's very likely in these kind of things that information like that might be given on to someone else, might be sold on the black market. Sometimes hackers just do these things to show that they can, rather than actually to necessarily sell the information. But that presumably will have some negative consequences at a quite high level, because if you have all this information about the registration of companies' intellectual properties being messed with or being stolen, I could very easily see that having knock-on effects in like court cases and that kind of thing down the line. But that's not the only place that's been a victim of cyber attacks. In 2021, Transnet's port operations were paralyzed for about a week by a ransomware attack. Ransomware attacks have been more and more common across the world. They target everything from companies to government departments. I know the NHS in the UK a couple of years ago was also paralyzed for a time by a ransomware one. Basically what happens, for those who don't know, is hackers get something onto your computer which locks you out from accessing your system until you pay them an amount that they demand, usually something like in Bitcoin or some other kind of way of getting around being traced. And perhaps even more concerningly is the Department of Justice, who you'd expect to be one of the better sort of functioning, more advanced government departments, has experienced its third ransomware attack in less than 3 years. And I can see no good coming of attacks on the justice system's digital footprint. This is, I think, completely a systemic issue across government. I know someone who worked in public hospitals, and they completely refused to ever allow a flash drive from their home to be plugged into a network computer at the hospitals, because it would inevitably be filled with many viruses and pieces of malicious software. So Herman, let me start with you. I think this is quite interesting. We can see that there are actually other countries in the African continent. The reporting here suggests that Ghana has managed to jump from 89th place in the world in one of the rankings of its cybersecurity system to 43 in just a couple of years. Mauritius is the best in Africa, ranking 17th in the world. This is a major vulnerability, and I think it's one of those things that always has frustrated me so much in these discussions about sort of smart cities or tech-based governance that the ANC every now and again kind of trots out, is that if you can't secure a website, how are you going to have a smart city?
Yeah, and the problem is that there seems to be a generational ignorance from a liberation movement that simply didn't consider the possibility that its physical infrastructure and its software infrastructure are of equal importance in terms of running a country. We've got a Department for Public Works that is literally responsible for the infrastructure within which government functions. And yet it seems that something like the software security, the physical security might, be allocated as a specific point of concern, but the cybersecurity, which is in this day and age of equal importance, if not more, seems to just essentially be left on the back burner. One of the horrific details from that story that you shared with us was the fact that the Department of Justice had allowed their security licenses, or some of the licensing on their security software, to expire in 2020. Now that is the equivalent of not realizing that the basic, boom gate no longer has a guard, and then going,
or not paying your electricity bill or something.
Yes. So what this gets down to is the same attitude of zero real investment in the upkeep of basics. I mean, that's why our court buildings, for example, are in a horrendous state. If that's the infrastructure that is actually visible on a day-to-day basis, that state officials can actually see the ceilings collapsing and the toilets not working, and that doesn't get addressed, how much more derelict or dilapidated are the invisible infrastructures like our software systems that are so important in this day and age? And I think what contributes to this is that they've just taken merit out of the whole system. To me, it really comes down to, once you introduce into a system the idea that skills and the ability to do a job isn't absolutely priority number one, it's only a matter of time before this sort of erosion occurs. We see it in hospitals in a terrible state, in courts, in the police's DNA laboratories and forensic facilities. So it's only natural. And that would extend to this sort of infrastructure collapsing as well. And it is almost so depressing that I almost want to ignore it, because the consequences of it is just so enormous. It makes South Africans and the South African state and the South African government so vulnerable to malicious interests. And if we think that we're on the grey list now because we can't, be reliably monitored in terms of our operations as a state and the financial system, just wait until this gets, on a massive scale as a central point of vulnerability, that not only is South Africa's cabinet purchasable if you're a Gupta, the state is also hackable.
So, Michael, I'm going to throw out a little bit of a wild theory here as to why, at least to what I think might be a little bit of a contributing factor to how we got into the situation and why cybersecurity, I think, has been so ignored. And that is that the ANC, through its policy of cadre deployment, has in many ways often, I think, made the state look a little bit like itself. And that my impression has generally been that the ANC is an organization of older people. And that this is one of the reasons why, for example, the Trade and the Competition Commission and the Trade and Industry Commission and government, who are usually very quick to stamp out anything that looks like entrepreneurship, were so slow to move on online shopping. They did get round to stamping their boots on it, but it took them a while. And also how, I think this is kind of one of those things that our government always seems to sort of forget about or miss, even when we have, plans for smart cities or things. I don't know, bit of a sort of suck theory, but what do you make of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think age is a factor. Funny, just earlier this morning, I saw a headline on the BBC about alarm at the fact that a very high percentage of I think it was 12 to 13-year-old children in Britain owned smartphones, and this was, considered to be a problem. I hope that I've managed to counter the kind of old farty risk of being 65 to the extent that I'm able to look at that and say, well, I think that's silly. Of course, young people are going to be on smartphones. That's what they're for. But I think Hermann's point and age, here is a factor. If you are getting older and you're unfamiliar with the world around you, the one thing you've got to do is consult people who do know, who are plugged into it, and that means you've got to look at merit, at skills. Who knows what's going on here? What is the real thing? It's very interesting looking at that story that we're referring to. It says that Ghana's cybersecurity, Ghana's ahead of us, by the way, improved so much that the country is now ranked 43rd, up from 89th place. We are behind countries such as Ghana, Tanzania, Rwanda, Egypt, and Nigeria. So it's not rocket science. It's simply a question. We've got to apply skills here. The comments that were repeatedly made were resources, systems, and skills. These are the things that need to be updated. And that comment from the listener saying, we're all a bit out of date. This is one of the issues. Young people know that you've got to be constantly updating. You've got to be constantly abreast of developments, and they are naturally, because they chase it and they're creating it themselves. People my age might think, well, I got antivirus software. It was about 10 years ago, but it's in my computer. And because you're just not familiar with this new world, maybe you assume that's okay. Well, you've got to have people who've got the skills, who are able to alert you to this, and you've got to spend money on them. So I think that point, as long as we are appointing people on simply the wrong basis, we're appointing them for whatever other ideological reason, instead of simply what it is we need to do. We have clarity about our purpose. We need to deliver services. We need to make sure the state functions effectively. Who is the best person to do that? That is really the only thing that ought to be considered. We are distracted as a state, as a society, by all kinds of other ideological objectives, which all more or less fall under that dreadful term transformation, which means the reverse generally. It means that we just sort of struggle on without doing any transformation at all, no change, and it's a status quo of failure. So it is a very great risk. I agree with both of you on that one.
Herman, any final thing to add on this topic before we move on?
And the tragedy is South Africa, it's not like the skills aren't here, and it's not like the skills aren't even part of the state education system, in the sense that I have friends and family and so on who studied computer science, who studied cybersecurity, who know these things, and go through the state education system at university. It sort of reminds me of the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal now. The University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2014 published a PhD that I referred to a few days ago when I was doing the Daily Friend Wrap with Makone. The KwaZulu-Natal University of the KwaZulu-Natal, funded within the same province by the same state, had the knowledge and the insight and the resources to analyze flood risks. To the same extent, we are paying as taxpayers for state education systems that are developing much of the knowledge that we need for these circumstances. The state is spending resources on postgraduate studies, on PhDs, and it's simply wasting the South African taxpayers' money and the potential and skills that the spending of that money has developed. And that's what makes it triply tragic.
Right, exactly. I don't think it's reasonable to say that, we've got less sophisticated IT sector in this country than Ghana has.
No,
it's just our state seems to be incapable of making the decisions to get the resources in our society to work for us.
And renewing a license is literally just an administrative exercise. It is just checking, what's the date today? interesting. I probably have to click the OK button today. Otherwise, we lose the records of a few million prisoners.
Indeed, I think there's very much an aspect of this which is about. I'm sorry, I completely forgot my point there. Anyway, let's move on because clearly my mind is falling off. Let us talk about the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, PRASA, which is very proud to have reopened 31 of its 40 corridors nationally for passenger rail services that were shut down following infrastructure theft and vandalism. So this was particularly bad during the COVID shutdowns when an enormous amount of rail infrastructure was stolen, mostly because it seems as there was no one there to guard it. Things were quiet. The trains weren't in use because people weren't allowed to go on public transport and all that. And without proper security, huge swaths of rail infrastructure were stolen. Everything from cables to railway sleepers to everything you can imagine. So our rail system has been pretty badly damaged by that. And PRASA has been working to try and restore this because this has, I think, become an increasingly highlighted issue recently, the complete collapse of rail services. Highlighting that point is that since 2013, according to Stats SA, the number of people who use trains on a daily basis has fallen by 80%. It was a massive decrease. Now, the Minister of Transport, while attending a ceremony where they were riding on a train from Soweto to Park Station in Johannesburg, was quoted as saying, "By providing affordable and efficient transportation options, we have empowered marginalized groups, improved access to opportunities, and fostered great and socio-economic inclusion." Herman, in our pre-show discussion, you took particular umbrage with this one.
Yeah, I mean, I just have to get this in here, otherwise I will be a disappointment to myself. The problem with the thieves of railway infrastructure is that they leave no tracks. Anyhow, all right, with that out of my system, the problem with that, the problem with that statement by the minister is that she's saying this presumably with a straight face in a country that has over a decade seen an 80% fall in passenger railway use. Now, the problem there is that is the opposite of inclusion. If people no longer are inside the trains, they are excluded from the trains. You can't argue inclusion and the deterioration of usage at the same time. And Michael, as you were pointing out in our pre-show discussion, the train usage and the passenger rail usage is part of our socioeconomic nervous system, to the extent that when trains don't run, people can't get to work. This isn't the UK where you have a replacement bus service because the roads aren't in a good state, nor are the buses that might replace the train. So for many people, transport is the defining question as to whether they can work, and ironically, for many people, whether they can vote or not. So just the ability of getting to a job or getting to a market where you can sell your skills, your products, is being undermined by a collapsing infrastructure rail system. It isn't a faceless crime. It isn't that, oh dear, the automatons can no longer move stuff. It is human beings can no longer go out and come back to feed their kids. And then the gumption to come with this idea that the restoration of things to the state that they were 4 or 5 years ago due to your own incompetence is somehow progress, when really it is just a slowing of dilapidation. I mean, that takes guts. One can say many, many things about Minister Chikunga, but my word, does she have grass.
Yeah, the opening line there that I read out is that they've only reopened 31 of the 40 corridors. So we're not even back to the state that we were sort of about 5 years ago in terms of rail infrastructure. Michael, what do you make of this? I mean, South Africa's never had this amazing public transport system in any of its cities. You know, we've had some buses and trains and things, but I don't think we've ever had a system sufficient for what we need. And into that space has flowed the minibus taxi organizations, which have actually created this absolutely incredible network that manages to get millions of people to where they need to be every single day, all over the country. But there are problems with that system. One, it's been overwhelmingly captured, I think, by gangs and criminal elements and that kind of thing, who seem to be running it like far more like mafia enterprises these days than sort of legitimate businesses. There's all sorts of problems with cost because there isn't proper competition. Only certain taxis are allowed to go on certain routes due to the gang fighting. So costs are higher, which is one of the reasons why people like railway often, is because it turns out to usually be cheaper than the taxis. What do you make of this whole story? I mean, it is. I think it's very clear now that South Africa does need more competition for the taxi space. To kind of detoxify that industry. What do you make of this story?
I mean, the taxi situation is a very complex one, obviously. I often have thought of it as kind of cowboy capitalism. I mean, it is in a way a market response, quite unregulated, unregulatable in a way. There is an argument for a measure of regulation in all free markets, but it does actually provide solutions to something I think of upwards of 2 million people every day. So it is a significant player, but it is a problem. Also, in many ways, they're often associated, as you say, with criminality, with vigilantism. Has been a terrible problem with taxi drivers here in the Cape. But nevertheless, it could be part of the solution. Must be part of the solution. It's not. There's no wishing away the taxi industry, and it does move people. But I think we are really a country that just lends itself to trains as a whole, and the cities especially would be perfectly suited to effective train transport. And part of the reason for making this argument, of course, is that certainly in the Cape, that's what we used to have. And we were talking before the show, I was thinking just a moment ago when exactly it was, but early 90s, I became a political correspondent in 1990. I remember commuting from Muizenberg to central Cape Town and returning home, often as late as 11 o'clock in the evening, and the train was the way to go. I could work on the train. It was reliable. There were umpteen trains every hour. It was completely dependable, and the same thing applied to people living in the poorest communities who had been pushed out to the periphery of the city by apartheid law. This is another thing we were talking about before the show began. The one thing that has always especially penalized victims of apartheid and continues to is that they were pushed out so far. So to get to work, they spend a huge amount of time and money, and then spend a lot of their earnings on doing the to and fro. That's a slightly different topic, but the fact is the trains are able to provide some relief in this process, reducing the cost of travel. It was said, I seem to recall, right end of the 80s, early 90s, that the public transport or the train commute in Cape Town was equivalent to a daily D-Day landing in the morning and in the evening. So, I mean, that gives you some idea of the number of people who are being moved very efficiently on a single track, no traffic jams, no delays, on schedule. So it's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't work. So here's this funny thing. We have this minister saying these absurd things. We want to kind of applaud this movement, this development, or this kind of movement towards a solution. 31 out of 40 corridors. I mean, that's, it's such a shame that we are now clawing our way back to a situation of 2013. I'm sure that I can't quite remember now, but in 2013, I'm sure we were way behind the performance of 1990, for instance. and there's no reason why that shouldn't be our objective. Getting back to trains that are absolutely reliable for everybody, and even in those days, it wasn't just the paler characters like me from the leafy suburbs. It was the whole of Cape Town. And that really ought to be the objective. So there's very little to applaud here, except that it just underlines the potential of train travel and particularly the commuting service. Whenever I think of trains, I'm always reminded of my childhood listening with my brother to that wonderful British duo Flanders and Swan, a kind of comic singing duo, and with some or other prelude to some or other song. Flanders referred to a respectable British matron who at some point observed that if God had intended us to fly, he would never have given us the railways. And I think, this is we're a country that really could benefit from speed trains, massive freight trains, two-line services between all the major centres and the ports. So any movement in that direction, I think, is a good thing.
So 2 points I want to make. One is the very bizarre thing that the ANC, which kind of casts itself as for the working man and as a left-wing organization, all these things. The one big successful rail project that they have produced has been the Gautrain, which is so expensive it's basically only available to the middle class for the most part, and it's mostly used by people to get from the wealthier parts of the city, Joburg, to the airports, which is just kind of bizarre. And I remember the debates from I was still a young'un when that project was being decided, but I remember some of the debates at the time. There were people saying, why don't we just pour more money into our existing rail infrastructure rather than creating this new one? Gautrain is relatively successful. It works. I'm not sure if it's making a profit, but at least it does provide a pretty good service. It's fast and modern and all these things. But maybe we could have spent that money better if we had just spent it on the rail system that actually served mostly the poor around Gauteng. And the second point is, I think the influence of the taxi organizations and groups like that mean that in order to fix the railway system, to get it back to the state that it was, and to enhance it further so it's more inclusive of more people, we're going to have serious police improvements as well, because as we saw during COVID, the railways are very vulnerable to infrastructure theft and that kind of thing. And also the sort of gangsterism that competition in the public transport space means that we've already seen over the last decade a large number of trains, particularly in the Western Cape, burned. I think almost certainly in connection to organizations like that, possibly taxi organizations. So this is actually, I think, a pretty difficult problem to tackle. Doesn't mean that government shouldn't be putting all their resources into it. Herman, what do you make of that?
And perhaps just something to observe. A few weeks ago, I think it might have been the three of us that were on the show when we discussed the theft of a substation. Now, that it wasn't you, Michael. It might have been. I can't remember who it was. But there must be. It's almost impressive to what extent you must be negligible or negligent to have train infrastructure stolen. It really. I mean, it's not small stuff. This isn't pickpocketing, nor is it shoplifting. I don't know if you've ever tried to lift a train track. It's a relatively heavy thing. So it just is quite astounding how we have degraded to this level of just such government incompetence that the government is managing to lose immovable property.
Yeah.
All right, let us move on to our last story. And this one is about Ekurhuleni's new mayor. So there was all this confrontation and calamity and political infighting between the ANC and EFF in particular in the Ekurhuleni municipality. And it looked like that coalition was going to collapse. But at the last minute, they sort of cobbled together a deal. And I think it was a mayor from the AIC was replaced by the same coalition with a mayor from the ANC. So the ANC is now back in at least the head position in Ekurhuleni, although I believe they gave a large number of MMC positions to EFF members in that government. The new mayor has, this is, I think, one of the first headlines I've seen of him, is that I don't know if he's gotten off to a great start in terms of building his political image, but he has blamed sewer leaks in Ekurhuleni on the residents' behavior. As the reporting on this points out, this is in contrast to a public protector report, which said that sewage spillages in Ekurhuleni are specifically due to poor infrastructure maintenance, which I don't think comes as any surprise. But this was during a 702 election town hall on Wednesday, and people from Katlehong were criticizing his government for not dealing with sewer leaks. And he said, quote, "Communities themselves are throwing foreign objects into the sewer lines, and that is where we must run many community awareness campaigns. The sewer line is designed to carry that which you flush and shower water. When our communities slaughter animals, they throw all those stuff into the sewer lines." Now, at first glance, this seems really not clever. I mean, firstly, as a political move, when people say, "Hey, there's sewage spilling into our rivers and our streets," and your response is to say, "Well, stop flushing so many dead animals," I don't know if it's a great way to bring people onto your side. But there is something to be said for this. Maintaining a sewer system is actually pretty difficult because, yeah, a lot of people flush a lot of things they really shouldn't be flushing. Michael, what do you make of this whole story?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I see this man is a doctor. I wonder what he's a doctor of. But one of the first things that occurs to one is that even if there is some rational basis for his saying what he's saying, and I'm sure there's all sorts of stuff that goes into the sewers and does cause blockages, and there are all sorts of behaviours which are typical of South Africans right across society that have caused one problem or another. But the obvious point is if maintenance was being done properly, this is where it would register, and this is where you'd begin to deal with it. And it's simply very foolish politics to try and pretend otherwise. So yeah, quite an extraordinary story, really.
Herman, I can feel it in myself, and I can see it in you as well. It's very difficult to resist making some sort of pun with regards to this story. But
yeah, no, I'm going to resist it. Just, when you're starting to make
flush those thoughts away, and
yes,
what's your take?
Yes. Whenever you start making sewer jokes on a podcast, you're in trouble. Anyhow, okay. So again, that out of the way, I think what's the problem here is that governments can't plan for the stupidity or the unforeseeable, or unforeseeable stupidity. Now that's fine, but the problem is, if your basic systems of infrastructure can't function even at the most basic level for something as predictable as a poo flush, then I don't think you have much of a right to then turn and point to carcasses as the source of all the problems. That is a bit like saying to someone who's falling from or if you're in a plane and you're sitting next to someone and the plane is on fire, hurtling towards the ground, that's a bit like turning to them and saying, "Sorry, you've spilt your coffee on my lap." So it's sort of, let's keep the perspective here and just perhaps understand that, yes, perhaps people shouldn't flush foreign objects down the toilet, but I promise you it's not the foreign objects that have caused 30 years of infrastructural decay. And perhaps a final observation: if this sort of politics is the skills level at which the ANC operates at a local government level, if this is the best they have to send as deployees at a local government level, were I any opposition party, the DA, Action SA, Freedom Front Plus, anyone IFP, I would consider this the greatest invitation in history to beat the ANC at local government level by making sure I get skills in there. that by making sure that my A-list players go to local government level, because that's where the ANC is sending their, freaking H-list candidates.
So, firstly, Michael, any final thoughts on this topic? But also, there was a discussion we had beforehand, which maybe we can close on, is that as we've said, it's very possible that there are people who are throwing things down the toilet system that they really shouldn't be, and that's definitely making the problem worse of poor infrastructure maintenance, all that kind of thing. Although I think my view on that is that the mayor's pleas are going to fall on deaf ears. South Africans in general are a pretty rambunctious bunch. I think we often just do our own thing. We don't always follow the rules. There's a sort of, we're not completely lawless, but we have a sort of general tendency towards that kind of way of living life. From the rich to the poor, I think that's often the case. And I think that at the end of the day, if you're going to try and tell people what they can and can't flush down their toilets, you're not really going to be, that'll be the last place in South African society that people will hold on to their right to do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
I'm not really sure what I could say about that in particular. I mean, it is, just to underscore what you've both been saying, for an ANC politician to come up with any kind of excuses and any reasons for things, it's just not believable anymore. It's simply become implausible that there is anything other than simply incompetence and taking the eye off the ball, not doing your jobs properly. Those are going to really be the reasons. And I think the same applies to the previous story in a way. It's going to be the same thing. It's going to be the skepticism about every claim, every promise, and for good reason. I mean, that's really the indication of the state we've reached. Is people just not believing, disbelief, incredulity, skepticism, cynicism, which is not very healthy. All of it.
Exactly.
Some of it's good, but now people need to act on that.
No, I think that's a really good point to raise, is that this really is, and we have talked about this on the show before, a symptom of dysfunction. It's the way that South Africans relate to their government. We expect the government to screw us over, and the government expects us to be disobedient. And this is kind of always the way things are, and it makes governance much, much harder, and it's going to take a lot of effort to repair that trust and relationship, so that South Africans will begin to, we'll hear something like this from a mayor and be like, oh, okay, I'll make sure not to flush the kilogram of cotton wool down the toilet that I was planning to, for whatever reason. Anyway, thanks very much for listening. We did go a bit long today. I apologize. I've been a bit all over the place myself. But we hope that you found the show interesting, and we will see you again next week on Monday. Cheers, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.